Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a webinar. We're thrilled to have you with us. And before we start, I wanted to quickly review some housekeeping to ensure that everyone has a smooth experience. Today, your topic is company-wide SLOs, building composite SLIs across many teams. And I'm very honored to have Max Nee from the New York Times as a presenter today. Max brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this topic. He has spoken before at our previous SLOCon conferences. So welcome back. And all of these are, by the way, available at our YouTube channel. I will share some links as Max is speaking in the chat with people to check out some of his other talks because all of them are truly great. Max, thank you so much for coming back as a speaker. I'm very honored to have you here with us today. I will let you introduce yourself further and the topic. And yeah, please let us know if you have any questions.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming today. My name is Max Nee. I work at the New York Times. I'm a staff software engineer. Currently focused on developer productivity. And some of the things that we focus on are just like helping software developers at the New York Times deliver the news to you through all our applications and services that we provide. So I'm going to talk today about company-wide SLOs and how to improve reliability across your organization. So this is something that I've kind of been thinking about in terms of, how to, like, if there's issues, outages, your software is unreliable, how that can kind of affect sort of everything across your stack, right? Not necessarily just like the software stack, but like your customers, right? So let's see where to start. Sorry, one sec. Okay. So when developing kind of like, a top-down approach in terms of like customer company-wide SLOs, where to start, right? So we want to start from, you want to really understand from the customer's perspective. So their entry points, what systems do they touch, work from the top down. So I'll use the New York Times as an example. So, you go to newyorktimes.com, it's successful that the news loads, right? That's like the number one thing that we do. And then obviously ads, because that's how we make money. And then your user data. So you presumably have an account or you're a paid subscriber of the New York Times. You want to make sure that, that information is available. And then personalized data. So we're working on providing news articles and other things that are relevant to your interests based on things that you've looked at, favorited, and read before. So, we want to make sure that sort of all of these things load and are providing value to you as a user. So what does that look like, right? So we have a few different systems, and obviously this is overly simplified. So you go to newyorktimes.com today. We want to load the news. That's obviously a front-end app that's currently running on a shared Kubernetes platform. We load ads and then your user data, and that data is stored. And then we have multiple services that process that user data. And all of that is running on a shared Kubernetes platform. So what we want to do is ensure that all of these systems are up and running and functional. And, from a customer's perspective, we want to ensure that all teams understand that that's who we ultimately serve and make sure that their experience above all else is the best experience that we can offer. And there's a lot of teams that kind of are behind the scenes that make these things work. And so how do we ensure that, we're providing the best experience, and how do those teams kind of work together in order to do that? So, how to measure these sort of disparate parts, right? So each component needs an SLO, needs SLOs, right? So from the front, entry point, right? Making sure that the news loads, and then all the way down to our shared, Kubernetes platform to make sure that that system is fully operational, and meeting the needs of the teams that are deploying their systems there, and then everything in between. And then how to correlate when things are broken between systems, right? So if like we're not able to load the news, we want to determine why that's not working. And sometimes if we don't necessarily, we have a path of like diagnosing those issues, but like how do we ensure that we're following proper paths, and like which teams to engage in order to make sure that we resolve those issues, or how do we ensure that like there is some fault tolerance allowed. So we, by having SLOs for each system, it reduces the time to resolution when there's an issue. But if we eventually roll all these SLOs up, right, it increases inter-team communication, because now the news team is like, hey, user data is not loading. We're, our SLOs are in violation. We want to make sure that, the user data platform team is aware. But also they should have SLOs. They'll have SLOs that are, obviously in violation as well. So this will then strengthen the resiliency of services, and a clear ownership over who owns what. And like if you're if the user data platform is working just fine, and but it's not loading on the homepage, like, let's figure it out and then put an SLO or an SLI on it, and then we can easily say who owns that SLO ultimately. um, so here is just a very simple example, right? So NewYorkTimes.com returns a 200. Assuming, another SLO would be news loads under 1 second, user data loads under 2 seconds, and then the custom news loads under 2 seconds. So we're looking maybe for about 5 seconds for like the whole experience to be up and operational for a user. Excuse me. And then we want to make sure that our Kubernetes platform is scaled and running healthy nodes. And we can have all sorts of subsequent SLIs. I mean, obviously, putting SLIs around Kubernetes is a little more challenging than, some of these easier to determine signals. But once we have these SLOs de de defined, we know where in violation, if one of these is failing, right, we're in a violation, we know where to go. So we can easily diagnose and triage. And then there's no finger pointing, especially when there's an outage or an issue, right? We can all sort of say, hey, team X owns this SLO that's in violation, as opposed to like, hey, everything looks fine from our end, but there's clearly an issue. And then you're on that call and you're staring at a dashboard and you're like, all right, who do we have to talk to fix this? And then, there's some ambiguity, frustration, all the things that kind of happen when there isn't like a clear path forward. So this sort of sets a good mental model as well as a documented model of like where things go. So once you have these, 5 SLOs, we can kind of look at the math of like how to roll these up, right? So what we want to do here actually is create a composite SLO, right? So and the one thing to think about this is each individual SLO will burn your error budget equally, right? So if the user data is not loading, that will create that will slowly bring down your SLO, and uh, um, that will slowly bring down your SLO or your error budget, and then obviously you can declare an incident if needed. Um, but like, let's look at the math, right? So just some rough numbers, but if you have many SLOs that you roll up into a composite SLO, right? You can have 3 9s, 9995, 9995. Maybe the user data service is 3 9s. You can see that it doesn't equally translate to 3 9s or 9995, right? It actually goes down each SLO you add. And so like you're looking at 9975, right, as a composite SLO. So that does give you some wiggle room, right, in terms of like downtime and error budget. But that also is something to keep in mind when deciding. And this is where, sort of inter-team communication becomes really critical when deciding on what your number is, right? It can't just be like plucked from a hat, or it has to be something worked towards. So if you find that you're constantly violating your error budget, especially in this composite SLO, you can kind of look at the underlying SLOs and say, hey, maybe this error budget is, or sorry, this number is too high. We should lower it. It may overall lower the composite SLO number, but it might be more reasonable if a system isn't, say, as critical to the performance of like NewYorkTimes.com, right? So that's just another thing to take into consideration. Obviously the people in charge probably want the most 9s. And but in reality, that might not be the best way to sort of move forward. So we'll move on to what not to do, right? So do not do, right? Higher level SLOs do not mean that teams can abandon their SLOs. And so we want to make sure that teams don't give up their own responsibilities for maintaining and monitoring their own SLOs and systems. And they should have subsequent error budgets. And if their SLOs are in violation, they should obviously notify up the chain, saying like, hey, there could be a potential problem. We're working to resolve it. So what this does is it saves time. So when the user data platform is experiencing an issue, they can preemptively notify, because their SLO might be 9995, and it might not trigger the overall composite SLO because it's 9975. You can now sort of get ahead of any potential issues. And this reduces incident management. So the dreaded like dragging everybody into a call and triaging, you can do it within your team before it gets to sort of involving more and more teams. And that way it also reduces your time to resolution. So what that means is your ability to fix and triage an issue and potentially not be in violation of the sort of company-wide SLOs, you will have it resolved prior to it triggering an alert on the overall SLO. And that's always a good thing, but also it it's just a way to make sure that teams are still responsible for this underlying systems and not waiting for the overall like SLO alert to trigger and then getting all the people together in one room. So here are some takeaways. So remember, each component still needs an SLO, right? So we're not abandoning all SLOs, but you can roll them up into one SLO to sort of gauge the overall performance of your application, your system, whatever that may be. Excuse me. teams should not rely on just one SLO. So if you're still having, if you have a composite SLO, each underlying team should be responsible for their system, and make sure that like you're still monitoring your system. So what this means is that you'll have overall better reliability and relationships between all the teams that make your user-facing application work. And then remember that your SLO map changes, so be prepared or adjust accordingly. So if you really want 3 nines, right, that means all the underlying systems are going to have to be even more resilient. And that might be a challenge, and or it might not be fully uh, uh, achievable. But that's really up to your company or the decision makers, right? So what is your tolerance of being in violation of your SLOs? And then also like what are the things that you can kind of think about in order to improve your SLOs overall? So this is just one way and a very simple way to think about like overall reliability and SLOs across your company. So, the decision makers can, ensure that things like how your application works, right? And all sort of the subsequent parts underneath sort of the top layer. And this is probably maybe a more holistic way of determining reliability, especially when you view it as through the eyes of a user or your customer. So like again, right? I work for the New York Times. So our job is to make sure that you get the news that you're looking for. And by ensuring that we have this top level SLO that sort of encompasses all of the systems, it will then be better representative of our overall health, in terms of what the customer or user perceives versus like all independent systems, even though they're interconnected in some way, shape, or form. Make sure that like we're sort of all in it together, which I think builds and helps the culture of your company. So that being said, I'm ready to answer some questions. So if you have any, feel free to type them in the chat or in the Q&A. I see we have one, and I'll read it here. What is your approach when working on defining SLOs for technologies that are not that easy to translate to SLOs like Kubernetes or databases? I think you can, and maybe, in terms of like Kubernetes, right? So you can say like, hey, our baseline for Kubernetes is to have, 100 nodes running at any time, right? Like that's our baseline. If we're in trouble, like we could be in violation if we're below 100 nodes, and the system Kubernetes is operating properly if we're constantly over 100 nodes. And for databases, I think there's kind of two ways to I think there's two ways to kind of think about databases, right? One way would be to probably monitor the health of the database itself, right? Like if you're seeing lots of excessive reads and CPU spiking, like those could be sort of SLIs that you want to look at, but also in terms of data in and data out, right? Like verify the correctness of that data, like making sure that reads don't or writes don't exceed something. And I don't know if that answers your question. So Okay, and then we have, so basically we want to use composite SLOs for all user-facing features that span multiple services teams. Um, Ideally, yes. There's obviously a lot that goes into how do you do that? So um, but I think it will be beneficial. Um, I think it'll be beneficial overall, right? So I can use another example, right? Like we have uh, a, our cooking application, right? Our cooking site. So basically, we want to make sure that like, hey, there's different systems that power each part of our cooking application, right? So we have recipes, we have your recipe box, you have like features of like videos and like what sort of keywords based on things that you're looking for. We want to make sure that like that data is represented, and each sub part of how we serve that data could have SLOs and then rolled up into one composite SLO of like, yeah, like can the user see recipes? Can the user save recipes? Can the user visit their recipe box? Can they, look at it that way? So yes, it would touch multiple teams. And I think it's like it might be sort of a cultural shift to kind of think like that. And who is the real owner of those sort of composite SLOs? But I think it would be helpful because then you have the ability to um, like engage with those teams, kind of understand what their constraints are, and then like work together, uh, kind of work together to put it all together. I hope that answers your question. So we have another question here. What was your experience trying to sell the concept of SLOs over traditional monitoring with the more skeptical teams? So we've worked very hard on our SLO journey, right? So it's been a years long process in the making. And I think it's yielded better results. And we've prevented a lot more issues by moving to SLOs versus like, people sort of discovering an issue, right? So like we have so like if you're in violation of an SLO, we have sort of the automation that's in place that uh, um, we have the automation that's in place to sort of start the process of incident management. So that way, like, it's as soon as you're, within 10 minutes of violation, right? The process is started up and the right people are sort of assembled in the right places to like start diagnosing and triaging the issue. And I think that kind of helps versus something might break, nobody really knows for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's a lot more upset people on a triage call. And we want to make sure that we prevent that from happening. And I think a lot of teams kind of see the value in that. All right, we have another question here. Do you have any error budget policy to be applied when the error budget is exhausted for a certain SLO? So that's really up to the individual teams. Uh, in the concept of like a composite or company-wide SLO, um, uh, we I think like we would take a look at which team kind of brought down or put us in the error budget, um, and kind of work with them to resolve that, right? Either by building up resiliency or making the necessary changes. There's like tech debt that needs to get taken care of to prevent that from happening. I think those are sort of those policies. Again, it's a team by team basis, because I don't know if it's like each team or if it's all teams at once that would bring down the composite SLO. It's usually like one or two teams. Um, uh, so it's like, that's how we would kind of solve or at least apply those error budget policies. But there isn't like an overall error budget policy yet. Got another question here. What did your timeline look like from ideation, implementation, and eventually to full-scale adoption of SLOs across NYT? So part of that was the timeline. It's still in progress because there are still a few like legacy applications that we're working with to like get them to adopt SLOs, but it came from sort of a not top down, but we decided on using one tool for sort of metrics collection, and that sort of helped shift the thinking and application of like how do we do metrics at the New York Times? What is application health? And then eventually like, all right, let's like use SLOs. So even though we're still in the midst of the journey, I think like 75 to 85% of like applications at the New York Times are using SLOs. And that journey actually started before I was working at the Times, but it started probably in earnest about 4 years ago. And then at least from ideation and then implementation, and the implementation and full scale adoption are still in progress, but we've taken a lot of roadblocks out of the way in terms of um, uh, we've taken a lot of roadblocks out of the way by creating metric collection libraries, as well as like SLO templates that teams can use. So that way they can just sort of fill out the requisite parts for their application. We have another question here. Did you use advanced math or statistics when developing your SLOs? So we use I'm not sure how to answer that question. We do use distributions from Prometheus. We rely heavily on Prometheus to like to do our metrics. So in terms of HTTP response times, I guess we use some statistics, but I think that question might be a little bit out of my depth. Um, but we do use, distributions as well as some percentiles to help determine some of our SLOs. Hopefully that answers your question. The question is, what tools, processes did you use to identify your key user journeys? We have a very experienced user experience and user design team that kind of mapped out like what the journey is. And we have a lot of like advanced sort of metrics in terms of like user journey data. So we've kind of synthesized that and turned that into like what that would look like and broke it down based on what components do they actually touch on those user journeys. I'll stay on the line for a couple more minutes here if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. And hopefully you learned something about how we can, build composite and company-wide SLOs.
Awesome. Thank you for taking that last question. Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So you can keep Max said that he could, stay on the line for a couple more minutes if you have questions. I will, however, take this opportunity to thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been a fantastic session. And I hope you all find it as insightful, inspiring as I did. A special thanks to Max for sharing his expertise and experience with us. We are incredibly grateful for the knowledge and energy you brought to our webinar. I hope you'll be back. And please remember to check our website and subscribe to Noble Knight's newsletter. And for updates on future events, we are trying to bring more webinars with exciting and great speakers like Max. I look forward to seeing you all again. Goodbye, and thank you so much.